Hello, and welcome as we come now to the second week, second of Lent. The readings start with this. The first comes from the book of Genesis, chapter 22, verses 1 through 2, verse 9a, verses 10 through 13, verses 15 through 18. So there's a division here from the total sentence. Second reading, Romans 8, chapter 31, verses 6 through 34, and the Gospel according to Mark, chapter 9, verse 2 through 10. Now, this week I'd like to spend the major part of our reflection on the first reading, the book of story from Genesis, which is the story of Abraham. It is the gospel is the story of the transfiguration of Jesus. We have spoken about this on other occasions because both Matthew and Luke also have the transfiguration of Jesus. We will come to that toward the end and maybe just give a few continuing reflections on there. The book of Genesis, and remember that the first readings through this B year have to do with covenants. Last time we saw with the Noah story, the covenant that God made with the whole world. Now we come to the person whom God makes the first covenant in terms of a nation and a people, and that would be Abraham. So in the background for the choice of the reading is this covenant, a covenant which God made with Abraham, by the way, in which the terms, remembering that covenant terms were always two ways. One was made by the powerful party, the other by the recipient party, had to agree, but the terms of this agreement with Abraham were really set up exclusively by God, and Abraham merely kind of doesn't even give consent, although in effect he does. Abraham, and I thought we'd give a little background on this because he certainly is one of the most important figures in the scriptural tradition and one of the most important figures among the mono-believing Christian communities, namely Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In Judaism, Abraham emerges as the first patriarch, as the father of the ancient people, and as the father of this covenant people of Israel. Christians see Abraham as the progenitor of all, regardless of peoplehood, and therefore he is chosen as a model of faith. And great Christian writers, Paul, for example, in his letters, uses Abraham as a model of faith. The Quran in Islam also speaks of Abraham as God's friend, and therefore very close to Allah, to the Almighty. So I mention this because Abraham's importance in the scriptural traditions of all three of the major Western religions is very important. Now, the story that is told to us this time in chapter 22 is perhaps one of the most discussed about chapters or stories in all of Israel's tradition, and in some ways even in Christian tradition. So I take this opportunity to kind of explore some of the aspects of this particular account. What is the account to begin with, just to quickly put into place what we will be talking about, is that Abraham is asked by God to take his favorite son, the son of promise to Sarah and Abraham, namely Isaac, to take him up on a mountain to offer him as sacrifice to the Almighty and as and here's where the discussions take place, as a test or an offering to God. So in the Israeli tradition, the story or the episode is remembered as the binding of Isaac. In the Christian tradition, the interpretation often is Abraham's sacrifice, or the sacrifice of Abraham. In either case, Isaac certainly turns out to be important here. Now, quickly surveying the material that is found in the book of Genesis with regard to Abraham, one remembers that Abraham is called by God to move from where he lives. Now, there's never really sure that there is a voice speaking to Abraham, but for whatever reason, he leaves Ur of the Chaldees and moves with his family to Haran. He then moves from Haran down south and comes into the territory which is known as Palestine, or is the Canaanite territory. So that's the beginning. Then there are a number of stories that are told about what Abraham does. He had moved with his nephew Lot. They had divided their peoples because of their size. Lot had taken the area down along the Jordan area, the area of the plains, and Abraham had chosen to be in the mountain area. Therefore, Abraham was more a herdsman, namely raising sheep and goats, whereas his nephew Lot would be more known for agriculture, for growth. Then there are stories, and we won't be able to go through all of them, but what I'm saying is there are a number of stories based on the fact that Abraham is made two promises by God, namely that he will be the father of a great nation, and secondly, that he will receive a land. Now, it is kind of interesting that as the stories unfold that Abraham has with those around him, with the peoples around him. In fact, at one point he has to rescue his nephew Lot, who was taken prisoner, and on his return is met by a priest from another religion named Melchizedek, and there's this interchange between Abraham and Melchizedek, which becomes part of a Christian story, particularly in the writings of Paul. But here's where we're going with this one. The promise is that Abraham will have an heir. Namely, if you're going to be the father of a great nation, you have to have someone who begins it. And at this point, now he's married to Sarah. And it's important perhaps in the stories here that although they are known as patriarchal stories, namely the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that the wives also play a significant role. In this case, Abraham's wife is Sarah. They are, or he, cannot conceive with her. What she suggests to him at one point is that he has a relationship with a slave wife named Hagar. They have this, and so Abraham does what Sarah had suggested, and a child is conceived, namely he is named Ishmael, who technically is the firstborn of Abraham, yet he is not to be the child of promise. In fact, tension between Hagar and Sarah grow kind of, not too well, because one says, I could conceive, the other to the one who can't, and you can see that there would be. And these stories are very human, a tension. So, in fact, Abraham has to send Hagar and Ishmael away, but they are saved wonderfully by the Lord. Now, that's part of this story here, because now Abraham and Sarah do conceive a child, a son, and they call him Isaac. So now you have, really, Abraham has two sons, Ishmael and Isaac, although it's Isaac who is really going to be the inheritor and the continuation of the Judaic tradition, and so that's why he is important. Now we come to this episode, and we presume at this point that Isaac is, at least he's old enough to be in his early teens. I won't say that he's a teenager, and he's not yet an adult, remembering that adulthood in Israel's tradition only begins once when one is 12 or 13 years old. In other words, when the physical maturity of a boy to a man has taken place. Now, a little bit of background here is that young boys, as they were growing up, were raised together with girls, usually, and therefore mothers, and were considered, certainly because they were boys, to be pampered and spoiled. So at the age of puberty, they therefore now came into the domain of the masculine, of the men, and there had to be some kind of discipline applied to strengthen them, because from now on they weren't going to just be kind of nicely treated, but would have to be able to, and this was an understanding, bear pain and suffering without flinching or crying. So physical discipline was the obligation on the part, of the men, particularly of the father, to treat their sons, and that they were also told that the most important quality that they needed to have in order for the future to unfold wisely was loyalty to family. So that's the background, again, of how we believe young men were raised. Now God says to Abraham, "Take your son to the place I will show and offer him up to me." Now, this is a tragic story in one way, and there are a number of interpretations of it. And as I've mentioned, it is perhaps one of the more discussed, if not most discussed, passages in the Hebraic tradition. And to some degree, although Christians have, what we will say, allegorized it, and therefore do not have as much concern with it as perhaps those who look at it, the story in the Old Testament. We are kind of interested in Abraham's prompt obedience to the command of the Lord. But let's look at it, and remembering that there are certain aspects of this story which are not really brought to our attention. So here is, what do I mean by this? Well, Abraham takes with him 2 servants and his son Isaac, and they go to the place which the Lord will direct them. The place is called here in the scripture Mount Moriah. Now, we're not quite sure where Moriah is, although certainly there is a long-standing tradition in Judaism that Mount Moriah is none other than the hill of Zion, on which is located the city of Jerusalem and its temple. And there are rich stories, particularly in Islam, that this is the place where the event that is narrated here took place, namely on the hill of Jerusalem, or where Jerusalem would have its temple. All right, so they come, it's a 3-day journey to the Mount Moriah. Abraham tells the 2 servants to stay there, and he and his son Isaac go up the mountain, bearing with them the wood and the fire, which will be necessary to build an altar to offer the sacrifice to God, which Abraham is being asked to do. Now, keep in mind that there isn't a lot of feelingness, as we would emotionalism kind of in the story, but certainly when we read this or people analyze it, that's going to be part of the concern. As they get near to the place where they are going to make this offering, Isaac says to his father, well, we have the wood, we have the fire, but we do not have the sacrifice. And Abraham kind of, well, we're not sure just what his feelings were. Keep in mind that Abraham knows what he is going to do. He is going to be slaughtering, or if you want, murdering, his son as a sacrifice to God. Does he tell Isaac this? We know dialogue no, and suspect that may not be the case. Abraham's response to his son Isaac is, God will provide. So they get to the hill, they build, however they make this little altar, they put the wood on, and the fire, of course, which will be important for burning the sacrifice once it is put in place. The story, as we mentioned, is called the binding of Isaac in the Israeli tradition. Pictures show young Isaac. Does he voluntarily do this because his father had asked him? Was there some force that Abraham had to exert on his son in order for it to happen? Anyway, as the story unfolds, Isaac is laid on the new altar that has been built, and the hand of the father, Abraham, is raised with the sword or the knife to slaughter his son. It's at that point that a voice from the heavens says, do not do this. Now I know that you truly believe and trust in me. And as Abraham looks around, he finds a ram stuck in a thicket. He brings the ram over, places it in the place where Isaac was, and therefore slaughters it, and the offering is made to the Lord. All right. So the substitution is made, and you could say, well, it has a happy ending. But is this a happy story, or should there be a happy ending here? What kind of God is this? And there are four kind of figures, perhaps, that we might look at as the analyze, and many analyze this story. Abraham, Isaac, God, and the ram. All right. Abraham has been tested before. This isn't the first time that he has been challenged by God to trust him. Certainly when God said, move from where you are to the place I will show you, Abraham had passed that test. So here the question now that Abraham has to deal with, remember, loyalty to family is one of the most important aspects of life here. Is Abraham's loyalty to family first and God next, or is Abraham now to put loyalty to God first and loyalty to family secondary? As we hear, Abraham yields to God and makes the choice that he will slaughter or murder. And these are kind of nasty words. I suppose we can just coat this over by saying, offer Isaac to God. Well, all right, if you can go with that, that's all right. What is the feeling of Abraham? We don't know what's going through his mind as this is about to happen. Other questions, excuse me, when we back up into the Abraham story is, how much did the wife, Sarah, know about what was going to happen? Did Abraham tell her what he was going to do? Did they have any discussion or dialogue? Did he keep this a secret from her? And of course, as some analyze this, after the event, even though the son is spared, what did Sarah think about Abraham, what Abraham had done? The text concludes by saying that Abraham returned to Bathsheba. But when he gets there, Sarah is gone. In fact, the relationship between Abraham and Sarah is not told anymore. In fact, the only time after this that Abraham has anything to do with, at least as the text tells us, with Sarah, is that she has died, and that Abraham goes to the place where she has died, purchases a piece of property for burial of Sarah, and this is important in the tradition because this is the first time in Canaanite or in Palestinian territory that the Israelis own anything. And so this is a claim to the land that is made by Abraham. But that's one of the aspects, different ways to look at this story. Abraham and his wife, what would have been the relationship of this event as the attempt to offer Isaac up? Well, what is the relationship with Isaac that Abraham has? We're not sure. Certainly Isaac loved, and by the way, he has two sons, Ishmael, whom we mentioned earlier, and Isaac. Technically, Ishmael is the firstborn, but it is Isaac who is the child of promise, the child conceived by Abraham and Sarah. So the brothers, eventually, by the way, when Abraham dies, much later, we don't find a lot of what happens to Abraham after the story here that is narrated for our concern. Both come to their father's grave for the concluding rituals. So there was still a relationship between the two. Now, what is this important at? Isaac is the progenitor of the Israeli tradition. Ishmael is the progeneration of the other nations. And so when the promise to Abraham was that you will be father of many peoples of great nations, here's how this transpires. So, God. Now what about God here? Could it be that God tests Abraham by asking him to slaughter his son? What kind of God is this? Why would Abraham do this? Now, here's where different interpreters come into play. One thought was, well, it was Abraham who got it wrong, not God. Abraham had looked around, and it is true that human sacrifice was going on among some of the other tribes and peoples of this period in time. So, is Abraham simply kind of following a tradition of offering to his God what the others were offering to their gods, namely, and often it was, a firstborn male, since he was considered to be the most important in terms of continuing the generations of people. So is it the case that Abraham has got it wrong, and that he's doing this not because God had asked him to do it, but because it was part of the cultural tradition of the times, and that therefore at the moment in which it is going to be carried out, God intervenes. Now, the intervention of God is often pictured as an angel who stays the hand of Abraham. Is this the God, though? Okay, so that gets God off the hook, does it not? Abraham has got it wrong, but God is still the God of life. Well, perhaps, but we're certainly not told that that's the case. So why does God allow this to happen? To test. Now, this is, of course, and so when we read this story, we know already the result, that this is a test. God is asking Abraham to offer up what is most important to him, and what is at stake here is his future because it is really through the child of promise that the future of Israel will take place. Is God asking Jacob to sacrifice Isaac to give all of this up? So in that case, it is truly a test of loyalty on the part of Abraham. And so maybe that's what's the important quality here that is brought to our attention. Loyalty. To whom does Abraham's ultimate loyalty belong? To family, to wife, to children, or to God? Well, of course, the thinkers like to think that that's the case. Still, there are a lot of unanswered questions here with regard to understanding God. Does God act in this way? Does God cause this to happen? God might allow it to happen, but the issue certainly of discussion and reflection is the causality of this. Does God want this to happen? Is God pleased somehow? God, who is the defender of human life, now asking human life to be taken in order to satisfy the wishes of the Almighty. We probably will not agree to that, but nevertheless, that is important. And we still are, when we read this, notice that this is not a request on the part of God, but a directive. It is not an anonymous offering. It is the one on whose future Israel relies. So, in that sense, it's God who is asking this, and Abraham's response is terrifying, that he is willing to do this. So, there is that aspect, okay? Questions still unanswered about the relationship of God. And the poor ram, of course, why is he brought in? Simply because becomes the victim of this story. Isaac is pictured as carrying the wood up to the altar, and Christians, and I thought that it might be just helpful here, interpret this as the wood of Isaac being the wood of Jesus on the cross. Here is what St. Augustine wrote, and I quote this so you can kind of get the Christian interpretation of this. On this account, Isaac carried the wood on which he was to be offered up to the place of sacrifice, just as the Lord himself carried his own cross. Finally, since Isaac himself was not killed, for his father had been forbidden to kill him, who was that ram which was offered instead, and by whose foreshadowing blood the sacrifice was accomplished? For when Abraham had caught sight of him, he was caught by the horns in a thicket. Who then did he represent but Jesus, who, before he was offered up, was crowned with thorns? So that's St. Augustine perhaps represents the Christian interpretation of this story. Finally, again, the gospel story, the transfiguration of Jesus, the epiphany of Jesus as the kind of promised one of God. We find Peter, just in closing, Peter says, well, let's make 3 dwelling places for you, but that is not going to happen. Is there a comparison here between, what I want to say is notice that it is a reference here of Elijah and Moses. This is one of the changes that Matthew and Luke will make with this account. Jesus, therefore, is pictured as a prophet like Elijah, and As Elijah was taken up into glory in a fiery chariot, you remember that's the end of his story, so many see this story here of the Transfiguration as a prefiguring of the resurrection of Jesus, and this story is told as Jesus is making his journey to Jerusalem, so that as Elijah was taken up, so Jesus in his resurrection will be taken up. So in that sense, this is just one way of interpreting this Transfiguration story as prefiguring the resurrection of Jesus, and that was found in that he will go up to Jerusalem where he will be handed over, crucified, and raised up on the third day. All right, there are many other things we could say here, but thank you for being with us this time. Hope to see you again.